We must speak the truth about terror. Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories, malicious lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves.
What happens? I tell you what happens. Blam!
I have a window that looks directly at the World Trade Center, and I saw...
No collusion!
Shit's getting way too complicated for me.
Welcome to The Antidote. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Roth-Cushel.
So we recorded and posted a 20-year retrospective of September 11th and talked a lot about the where we see things as far as the particularly dealing into the who and or the who and the how, the who and the why of September 11th as it relates to that aspect of it in particular. And people can go and listen to our part one, our friend, in addition to where we have it posted on our via anchor to the major podcast distributors. Our friend John Swin posted part one on his channel, so you can check that out. So that's up for people to check out. And now with this recording, I guess we'll call this part two, I guess, Jeremy. But we want to take a look at a few stories that we had our eye on over the course of the September 11th 20-year anniversary. And so we're going to get into a few stories that we've had our eye on. We're going to start with this. We're going to start with the controversy surrounding the Spike Lee HBO miniseries, Epicenters, New York City. So, Jeremy, do you have anything you want to say before we get into that, or would you like to just get to the articles?
Let's just get into it. I mean, I guess one thing I would just say is that the conceptual structure that we've approached both 9/11 and the 11/9 operation and the continuity there is the combination of the intelligence operation, which is the legend side of it, the false flag part of it, really. You know, you have to have a patsy, or you have to have a backstory at the very least, and that is the intelligence operation. And that is a very legitimate area of focus in both of these places, 9/11 and 11/9. But I don't believe it's intellectually legitimate to stop there. And I think it's helpful to introduce this idea of a holistic conceptual framework so that it can be recognized when we fall into getting stuck in any of these areas. So that would include then the military operation. The military operation is the part of the actual physical phenomenon, the actual attack itself, the things that could be then defined by ballistics or physical forensics that point in specific ways. And this is usually the definition of a false flag operation, is that the forensics do not line up with the patsy, the finger pointing, basically. And so those two things are important to distinguish and to separate out. And then finally, and in a certain way, this category is really more and more crucial, is the what we titled the counterintelligence part of the operation, which is the cover-up part of the operation. And that includes so many different layers and even approaches to cover up. And so in that realm, doing some background historical research into the ways that previous deep events, state crimes against democracy, false flags, have been apparently covered up. And some of that is not really well parsed out, but from just the basics of things like intelligence agencies and propaganda operations over history, and their information operations, there's bits that we know in terms of the way that one might cover up a massive operation such as September 11th after the fact. And crucial to that would be things such as what might be called limited hangouts, where the perpetrators get ahead of the investigation, the public investigation, by releasing certain strains of evidence or focusing on certain strains of evidence, and creating certain lines, maybe invisible lines that are the limits to both understanding and public speech. So, for example, a good example of this would be we were lied to about 9/11. It's true. It's true as far as it goes, but it's an obvious limited hangout, especially 20 years after the fact. In 2001, like I said before, and that wouldn't have been a quote unquote limited hangout in terms of the level of the public investigation into September 11th. There'd be enough there to say, to assert that, and it wouldn't be a total limited hangout. In 2021, we were lied to about 9/11 is a limited hangout. And it doesn't mean that it's not true, but it's obviously limited. Okay, that's one thing. Then you can imagine things like red herrings, where there are wild goose chases, either that end up in a place that is a limited hangout, or something like a disinformation, where you get uh, stuck holding a rotten bag of some sort. Uh, and so that and think about the where that goes back, a red herring. I think that goes back to like hunting days, where the stinky fish is used to throw a dog off the trail, I believe. Um, and so there that can be other things that have popped in. So I would, for example, I would say something about Building 7 is a bit of a red herring. It doesn't mean that it's not true, that it was obviously key to understanding, but it's a red herring away from the World Trade Center towers themselves, which is where the very, very public and the demolitions happened. Tons and tons of videos from all around. And then also the place of the majority of the murders on September 11th. So a move to focus on Building 7 away from the trade towers, I would say, is something like a combination of a red herring towards a limited hangout, for example. Or, as I mentioned before, the question of jet fuel doesn't melt steel. That's a very tricky one because it points away from the actual physical forensics, as if first of all, as if all that we're dealing with is quote unquote melted steel. It plays directly into the question, the structure of understanding that was put forth by the official scientific investigation in terms of a progressive building collapse. The whole idea of the collapse is based on the somewhere between weakening and melting of steel by jet fuel, for example. And so instead of focusing on the actual physical forensics, some of them which I described in our previous show, which has to do with dealing with tons and tons and tons and tons of concrete being turned into some of it into even hot vapor, but lots of it into very, very highly micronized dust and plumes with a lot of energy behind it. But then also the question of where did a lot of the human bodies go? How are big portions of the building and big pieces of structural steel being seen sort of going up and out in arcs in relationship to a quote unquote melting steel. So that I think is another example of the way you can get caught in some of these memes and these popular phrases that really represent a cover up, part of the counterintelligence operation behind the cover up of September 11th. So those three parts I think are really important to understand, all of them and to understand them in their own separate spheres. The intelligence, the legend side, i.e., the Al Qaeda hijacking buildings, the Bujinka plot, the planes conspiracy, the Al Qaeda in the hills of Afghanistan, the Hamburg cell, the training hijackers being fought, being even those that were being followed by Israeli intelligence, for example. All of that is the intelligence side of the operation. Then the military operation, the Pentagon going boom, the World Trade Center going boom, the all of that, the physical aspect of what actually happened, what blew up, and then finally counterintelligence. How did it get covered up? How is it still being covered up to some large extent today? And that includes a whole array. And I would say going forward over time, I think it makes a lot of sense for us to understand more and more, not just about, I think, the military operation itself, because that's really important to focus on. The intelligence part is pretty well understood. It's not well understood in context very well about how it was very likely a cultivated and then ultimately hijacked operation that was utilized in order to then frame up a false flag military a demolition operation. But then the counterintelligence side of it, I think, is really what we really want to focus on to really unpack and dissect how how the complexity and the holistic understanding of 9/11 has been held back. And there I just slipped into it. One of the ways that it's held back is by calling it 9/11, and in all of the ways that I mentioned before about how it dehistoricizes it, how it immediately links it to a brain trauma in terms of 911, and all of that. So that's what I wanted to say. And so today, I think what we're going to be looking at is a lot about the counterintelligence conundrum and pitfalls that some fall into, some perpetrate, and how it's all hanging out together.
All right, thank you for that, Jeremy. I concur. I concur with that. And there's a lot of layers to that. Perhaps the and one aspect of this is this controversy over this. I believe 30 or so, a half hour or so of material that was supposed to air on as part of a Spike Lee's mini series for HBO about epicenters, New York City, basically New York City since September 11th. And it was a half hour or so devoted to questions and uh, about about what happened to the World Trade Center towers. Richard Gage was supposed to be featured among other people. I believe William Rodriguez is in there, and I believe Bob McIlvaine was featured. But the controversy was around Richard Gage of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, and Spike Lee using his platform to boost the discredited conspiracy theory that the World Trade Center towers were brought down via controlled demolition by explosives within the towers. And so it's very this is, I would say, it's probably one of the more mainstream controversies in recent years in terms of directly involved in like mainstream media. Would you say that, Jeremy?
Yes, definitely. I think it's probably, at least in the last few years, it seems like the most prominent 9/11 controversy that we've seen, I think.
Yeah, I guess you'd have to go back, maybe even go back to something like Rosie O'Donnell. And I mean, I don't know if there's any real notable cases since then, but that's really going back to like the late 2000s to really see this on in a high profile position via a Spike Lee documentary, somebody who has a ton of exposure, has and so it's interesting. We, from the perspective of how we covered this, it's very interesting how the aspects of the way the story is covered combined with the manner in which the story itself, the issue of September 11th itself, coming from the perspective of architects and engineers and Richard Gage, is put out there, and also how the actors within, say, media, within certain circles who want to discredit and work against such efforts to feature such information within any type of like programming with the platform. It's interesting, both the presentation and the reaction to it and the way it's used. I mean, you've got anti-Semitism thrown in there. You've got it goes all the way from once again, we're giving the kooks the platform over the proven people at the National Institutes of Standards and Technology who have proven this it's safe who have proven this to be all ridiculous, and going all the way from there to the standard the accusation of anti-Semitism, bringing in the idea that questioning what happened on September 11th is anti-Semitic. And so I believe we even found some links talking about Spike Lee and 9/11 epicenters, and even linking all the way to the protocols and post 9/11 ADL documents talking about 9/11 and anti-Semitism. So it seems to be kind of all over the place. Yeah, the reaction to this. But in terms of what you just discussed, like, I do think that this program and the reactions to it fit into the to what you just went over with the aspects of what we're focusing on with relation to September 11th, broadening our understanding, and these pitfalls that people get into, particularly here with just making it, I think, about the towers and the science behind it, and even Richard Gage bringing in other things that don't have anything to do with like the facts about who did September 11th and why, or even how. So
Well, yeah, I mean, that's been one of the seen as a specific strategic approach by architects and engineers for 9/11 truth over the years, basically since their origins in the 2000 and when 6 or 7, right in there, that they focused uh, totally on the forensics of the physical forensics and not the political forensics, you might say. And that was seen as a way of keeping it totally professional and credible, and away from quote unquote theorizing or hypothesizing, even though in terms of the social or political context. So that's always been a thing. I mean, there's also been controversy about whether AE 9/11 truth is uh, limiting the hangout of the physical forensics, understanding the advanced aspect of, or the levels of explosive weaponry that would likely have been needed in terms of producing the actual physical effects that we saw. So, but in the reports are that I've heard that in the right up to into the approach of this 20th anniversary of September 11th, that uh, Gage and architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth split, and he was sort of pushed out. It sounds like because he was, because of some of the things that you mentioned, where he was bringing in other his own political opinions about other things and other issues. And I think this can be seen very clearly, even in terms of the approach of the classic 9/11 Film Festival at the Grand Lake uh, Theater. I believe it's in Oakland, in the Bay Area, and the poster for it this year was the Twin Towers as the jabs, basically. And so there was the crossover, and meanwhile other people were attempting to reintegrate the question of the anthrax attacks back into the September 11th operation, which I think is totally appropriate. And sure, are there things you can are there resonances? Are there continuities in relationship to the newest 3/11, to September 11th and 9/11? Yes, but it shows that it's a similar kind of problematic landscape in the way that we've been analyzing where the quote unquote truth movement and the patriot movement went under the 11/9 Trump operation. Is it either devolved and or was exposed to have been a thoroughly dirtied up operation with tons of cover up around uh, Trump networks and criminality, but also a degradation of even the discourse around the uh, original issues, such as September 11th, to the point of where it became very, very rare, almost non-existent, to have a discourse that would truly integrate the these network analysis to show this continuity between 9/11 and 11/9 in basically any of the quote unquote alt media. And so it is interesting that you have Spike Lee. We haven't seen any of this, so we don't actually know how this was all put forth, whether there was some context, some actual real political context about what that might mean, if there is some taking on of the physical forensics and AE 9/11 truth, and that these were demolitions rather than uh, progressive collapses from plane impacts. And but what we do know is that there's actually a response from architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth by Ted Walter specifically, about a week after September 11th, wrote an article titled "Spike Lee's 9/11 Doc Still Has the Building Blocks He Was Laying for His Controlled Demolition Expose." And maybe should we read a little bit of that, Greg? Do you think?
Yeah, we can do that. Yeah, I think this article gets into some of the reasoning for why this person, particularly involved with AE 9/11 Truth, feels like this documentary, despite the removing of footage and of portions of the documentary, particularly related to Richard Gage, that there's still information that can be used and that can be built upon to further the case and further the planting the seeds of asking serious questions about what happened on September 11th. So yeah, let's go through this article. Let's go through some of this article.
Okay. And I just want to reference the Slate article that we talked about before. It's titled "Spike Lee Has Fallen Down the 9/11 Truther Rabbit Hole" by Jeremy Stahl. And there's not much there's not much background on Jeremy Stahl as a journalist, but it looks like he's been covering this specific angle from the quote unquote debunkerism, the debunkerist side for a long time, actually. And in this article, I'll just read a few paragraphs here. He actually references earlier articles that he wrote. One of them, which was an Architect magazine, which you'll see as it comes up. Okay, this was published also on August 24th, 2021. So a couple weeks at least before September 11th, getting ahead of this. And this is involved, it looks like, in terms of the Spike Lee response and "Give Me a Chance" and all of that. You'll see something different, which I guess we did see, but we didn't see it, but we heard about it. All right. Quote, "On Monday, the New York Times reported that Spike Lee devotes a significant amount of time in his new 4-part HBO series, NYC Epicenters, 9/11 through 2021 and a half." Even the titles doesn't even make sense because it references 9/11. Which 9/11? Chile, as Amy Goodman would harp on almost every, I remember like 10 years straight, Amy Goodman would take every 9/11 uh, anniversary to make sure to focus only on Chile, the Chilean
The
coup.
other 9/11.
Today, we're having on Noam Chomsky once again to not talk about 9/11 2001.
it'd be interesting. I don't think Amy Goodman's ever covered it from the context of Henry Kissinger as a key player in the events in Chile, and taking that to Henry Kissinger and September 11th, 9/11 Commission, uh, Hank Greenberg, Center for National Interest. She won't go down that route.
No, let alone then the 11/9. I mean, that's you see Kissinger 9/11/73 to 9/11/01 to 11/9/2016. He's in the mix. He's in the mix. That is a key figure, I'd say. So,
We're gonna make the economy scream.
and then Noam Chomsky, what would Noam Chomsky say to Henry Kissinger?
I'll have to.
Okay, we'll work on it.
Well, anybody could go online for 2 hours and find Henry Kissinger to be some kind of expert on Russian affairs.
There you go. All right, so back to this Jeremy Stahl article at the Slatest. A hot Cheeto and spinach dip is the sub. What the heck? That's Slate's subheading? Totally weird, dude. Yeah, that sounds about right, actually, in terms of some of the fakery going on here. Fake ingredients. All right. Quote, NYC epicenters, 9/11 through 2021 and a half. To the group Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, which promotes the conspiracy theory that the Twin Towers were brought down by a controlled demolition as part of an inside job. Unquote. I mean, an aside here, isn't the planes in Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, that's a conspiracy theory too. It's just a different conspiracy theory. I guess they would insist that that's conspiracy fact, and then demolitions or conspiracy theory. All right. Quote, about a decade ago, I interviewed Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth founder Richard Gage multiple times and attended one of his events for articles in Slate and Architect magazine. Unquote. An aside here, the name of the article that he wrote for Architect, the Journal of the American Institute of Architects, was July 19th, 2012, titled Architects Shy from Trutherism. Architects didn't show up for a 9/11 architecture conspiracy documentary screening, and the AIA doesn't want its name associated with trutherism. Okay, so that's what he's referencing, some of these earlier articles. Okay, back to Spike Lee has fallen down the 9/11 truther rabbit hole by Jeremy Stahl. Quote, Gage is responsible for peddling some of the most pernicious and long-running lies about the 9/11 attacks, which is why I was surprised that Lee, HBO, and Warner Media might be lending his group any amount of time. I had to see for myself to what extent Lee's documentary actually promoted Gage's fantasies, so I checked out a screener for episode 4, which is due to be released around the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. What I found was surreal and demoralizing. Lee devotes 30 minutes near the very end of his series to relitigating arguments that have been debunked 1,000 times. And there's a link there that I'm not sure where it goes to, but Screw Loose Change, the blog. That's not a credible source. Okay. I mean, that's like when I was first investigating September 11th. I read Screw Loose Change because it helped me knock down the straw men, the red herring, the limited hangout, the false facts. But in terms of a credible approach to the totality of the truth around 9/11, Screw Loose Change is not a definitive, quote unquote, debunking. Back to the article. Quote, specifically, he presents about a dozen conspiracy theorists and members of Gage's group, including Gage himself, in a back and forth with 3 credible scientists who investigated the 9/11 attacks in a teach the controversy style format that presents the truth behind 9/11 as an open debate between 2 equally valid sides. In terms of conveying the facts, this is a bit like presenting COVID-19 vaccine skeptics in a debate alongside Anthony Fauci, or Holocaust deniers alongside the Simon Wiesenthal Center. Interesting reference, by the way. or a clique of climate change skeptics alongside the authors of the United Nations IPCC report. And then finishing up here, unfortunately, it's also clear from Lee's presentation in the film, as well as his public statements, where his leanings are on this quote unquote controversy and where he wants the audience to land. In a New York Times interview published on Monday, for instance, Lee promotes previously debunked quote unquote evidence of controlled demolition, such as, quote, the amount of heat that it takes to make steel melt, that temperatures not reached, unquote, and, quote, the way Building 7 fell to the ground, unquote, was suspicious. All right, I'll finish there. But you see, exactly as I mentioned in some of, as we were introducing this, that we go directly to the red herring and limited hangout the meme warfare, the amount of heat it takes to make steel melt. What kind of heat and force does it take to vaporize molybdenum? I mean, that's a specific question that has specific answers, that has specific implications for the actual physical forensics of September 11th. And then, of course, they say, and the way Building 7 fell to the ground. All right, and jet fuel, all this stuff. This is a perfect example of the way that this is I believe, a controlled horseshoe of some sort. And even the way that he was talking about the that Spike Lee had presented this originally sounds perfectly tuned to what I associate with the long-term deep CIA line. I guess we'll never know, but it's okay to debate it.
It was interesting how the basically a back and forth between Gage and the official scientists, and it's interesting. I think either in that article or in another article, similar article we had identified about this controversy. There was a portion with I guess an exchange on COVID-19 where it's a rap artist by the name of Waka Flocka Flame claiming that COVID-19 doesn't affect black people or whatever, versus Van Jones being like the authoritative source who says that this is a problem and obviously it does, and these conspiracy theories are ridiculous. So it seems that also, I mean, to be fair, without the context of watching the documentary, it sounds like the same type of conversation comes up in terms of COVID as it does with September 11th, with a very interesting figure of Van Jones, the play off of the skeptic within the black community represented as the COVID skeptic / borderline denialist. So
It's interesting too because then the article references Gage on COVID and then definitely down to Gage and the Jews, quote unquote, and while also then highlighting once again that some of the corporate criminals in this case are HBO and Warner Media, which is very interesting that Spike Lee was allowed to publish this under HBO and Warner Media. And so these kinds of things begin to be very suspicious to me in terms of the nature of the quote unquote controversy, especially after the more and more that we learned about how at the core of any single media entity, it was Warner Media and their owned entity HBO that was at the epicenter of the board of the CNI, which really, of any single entity that we can point at, I think really holds the character key in many ways to those who span the gap from credible suspects hovering around 9/11 to credible suspects hovering around 11/9. And so to see HBO and Warner Media again sort of take the limelight with this controversy where they're now attacked by the Jeremy Stalls of the world, and then they're said to have probably put the pressure on Spike Lee to have mellowed down his quote unquote controversy. I'm just this to me smells of counter long term. These are counterintelligence grist basically for the long term mill of maintaining the 9/11 cover up, which always takes sprinkling the controversy in certain ways. It doesn't mean that all controversy necessarily is not organic or is not potentially beneficial. It can be, but this kind of stuff, I think it totally seems to have defined exactly away from a focus on the what, and then painted the what and the how, and then painted the real serious questions of the who and the why with the terms of like the Jews and COVID is a hoax or these kinds of things. I think is what it really does.
It's very interesting that you identify here Warner Media, of course, and Warner, HBO, Time Warner, and Richard Plepler and Jeffrey Bukes, and even Jeff Zucker of CNN being at the Mayflower Hotel, the luncheon prior to the Trump's Mayflower Hotel speech with Henry Kissinger and Jared Kushner, and I'm sure Dmitry Simas was present, and then the person brought in to be the official source on the COVID is Van Jones, CNN employee. So,
So
um,
true.
and and then one thing I want to bring up here, and like you almost get the impression, this is just speculation on my part here, but you almost get the impression that this could even shape up to be like some type of uh, Oliver Stone JFK moment potentially. Whereas like this is the, if we haven't Spike Lee playing the role, maybe wittingly or unwittingly, knowingly or unknowingly playing a role of like a Oliver Stone, in terms of Oliver Stone being key to the culture of conspiracy around the Kennedy assassination. I don't know. Could it become something like that? I don't know. I mean, comparatively, the movie JFK was 28 years after the assassination. This is shaping up on the 20th anniversary. I mean, it may be completely not that, but I just can't help but think that. And Jeremy, going back to what you talked about, like with this some type of, it seems like, controlled horseshoe at some level or another. And this might not mean anything, but I think it's worth pointing out. It was very interesting when you look at even looking at the personas of Spike Lee and Richard Gage. It's very interesting that you've got here Spike Lee, who is this. He is it was his film on Malcolm X is one of the definitive accounts of the life of Malcolm X. That's been put out there in the mainstream, and also Spike Lee. Getting into some of the horseshoe topics that we've discussed in the past with relation to some of these aspects as it relates to race relations and the fringes of society. Spike Lee was the person who made this movie about David Duke and the Ku Klux Klan, black Klansman, black KKK Klansman, about the the infiltration of I believe it was Duke's affiliated chapter of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1970s. And then on top of that, interestingly, going full horseshoe from Malcolm X all the way to David Duke, all the way back to the Malcolm X adjacent, at least legacy-wise, Nation of Islam, and Richard Gage, has spoken at numerous Nation of Islam events over the course of the past years, at least a couple of events. And so I thought that was interesting in terms of, you have Spike Lee as this legacy person who's out there in terms of shaping these narratives, in terms of our understandings of some of the key aspects of the very, in a lot of cases, I believe, agents, your David Duke types, who are used as the almost like boogeymen, so to speak, in terms of like influencing the public into views on, as it relates to race relations, and the further division of our society on a racial and societal basis. And then coming full circle with even featuring in his documentary. I don't know what kind of connections there might be between Spike Lee and maybe Farrakhan adjacent individuals, but it's interesting that then you even have this full circle of Gage speaking at the Nation of Islam conferences. And it may not mean anything, but I think it's still interesting. And Spike Lee is like this legacy media narrative shaper, is in terms of his documentaries and films. I found to be very interesting.
Very, very much so. And I think that I remember that in the run up to the 2016 election, that we identified Farrakhan and Alex Jones coming together in the run up, and a sort of a an endorsement of Trump, really, at some level. Like the Farrakhan wasn't as direct about it as Alex Jones was, but that was a moment that we were like, oh, there's a this we both started being like, oh, there's a fix in here in terms of this quote unquote opposition to the establishment. We noticed that that was a very interesting horseshoe, especially since it was during a time where Alex was beginning to have blowback, some blowback about how he was like so actually a crypto David Icke, where he was really dog whistling about the quote unquote Jews and was just trying to be politic in relationship to it, and then for him to be so friendly with Farrakhan, I think was very very suspicious in that moment. And so I think you might be right that there's something to this that begins to feel like it's not as supercharged as Oliver Stone and the movie JFK in relationship to its impact, the level of the controversy, and all of that. It still feels a similar kind of situation in many ways, and such as in the Oliver Stone I, uh, case, we've over and over identified the glaring nature of Israeli military intelligence, Lekam, in that case, nuclear intelligence, very likely. Agent Arnon Milchan being the executive producer, and what that meant about what was going on in terms of the who and the why in the film JFK and what was not being covered there. And there's something sort of similar going on here, I think, when you look at it as HBO Time Warner, and also like that the fact that this is Spike Lee does this at a time when it's told from a New York perspective, I believe, and that it's COVID is a crucial thing, and COVID conspiracy theories are acknowledged as as very very dangerous. And so this is, I think that it's meant to put it into some kind of similar kind of space that the film JFK seemed to have served to at least some of the potential perpetrators of the Kennedy assassination itself. And so, unless you have any more comments on this story, Greg, let's move on to the media depiction or the new film about the original 9/11 September 11th paymaster, Kenneth Feinberg.
No, I really don't have any final statements on it, except for I think that this controversy is like a microcosm of the of what we've it is what we've discussed. And in terms of the legacy, it's not a perfect analogy between Oliver Stone, JFK, and Spike Lee, September 11th. But in terms of like the converging of like the influence it could have over time, in terms of this, I don't know if 9/11 epicenters is going to be the cultural like phenomenon that or 30 minutes that was left out of the documentary is going to be the cultural phenomenon that JFK was. But it's interesting in terms of the shaping of the narrative as time goes on, particularly September 11th being brought in more and more directly with COVID-19, in terms of what you discussed with the 9/11 Film Festival, or even David Icke on this otherwise, it seems, solid information being put out on 9/11 stream, getting into bringing COVID directly into it. So I think this is a glimpse of what's to come with the future of anything that's related to September 11th being moved more and more directly with this some of the more, I would say, probably misleading or toxic weaponized narratives out there about COVID-19 and everything surrounding it. So
And one final point I would make about the way that it's linked to COVID-19 is, and I've said this a few times over our analysis of COVID-19 specifically, is that a very similar kind of counterintelligence structure to the cover up of SARS-CoV-2, the origins of SARS-CoV-2 itself, and then the COVID-19 pandemic, it feels very, very similar in many ways to what happened with September 11th. And even if you think about what Gage was seen as being quoted about the quote unquote tyrannical response to COVID-19, or the using the word of hoax, that is very reminiscent of very similar kinds of counterintelligence strains in relationship to September 11th. To this day, there are those, including the so-called peace movement or the so-called civil libertarian movement, who would do everything they can to focus not on the origins of the September 11th attacks themselves, but to focus on the overbearing, overwrought, tyrannical, totalitarian quote unquote response, whether it was the ongoing war response, or whether in terms of the quote unquote peace movement, or whether it was the surveillance state or the TSA in terms of the civil libertarians. That was a very specific move. It relates in my mind to something like we were lied to about 9/11. That's all we need to know about the origins of 9/11. Let's go right to the question on the response, right? And you've already played into the hands of the perpetrators when you're talking about response, right? Rather than the next part of the operation. So there's that. And then there's also the focus on the hoax, or the undermining or the underplaying of the actual death and destruction of the originating operation itself. So with SARS-CoV-2, instead of a focus on the forensics, now there are those who have done that, but they're not the quote unquote truth movement. They're not the quote unquote peace movement. They're not they're not the justice movement. They're not the civil libertarians, you know. So this is also being avoided, the actual origins, the potential who and the why of COVID-19. And this is even more glaring than September 11th, because September 11th was at least recognized everybody recognized it was an attack. The controversy, if we want to call it that, is about who did it and why, and some hows and whats, right? It's not about whether it was an attack. And so now with SARS-CoV-2, that whole line is being covered up now even more and more in terms of the rollout of the lab leak theory, which immediately puts it into a hangout of eliminating the question of a deliberate release or a deliberate provocation or spread, you know. And so I just wanted to point out that this combination of focusing on the tyrannical response, whether it's the lockdowns or whether it's the jabs, or if it's the question of the quote unquote hoax, to undermine the nature of the attack itself, are both avoidance. They're both counterintelligence contrivances, I believe, away from the who and the why that really should be the focus. So it's very interesting that this is where now Gage gets himself in trouble, whether it's in Slate or with architects and engineers for 9/11 truth itself, that is in relationship to playing the same silly game at best in relationship to information warfare around the most current 3/11, let's say, in terms of COVID-19. So I just noticed that. And so this is why, for those who are of good faith, I think it becomes more and more important for us to get our minds right and to really get serious about how rigorous we are conceptually. And now there's always been those who have been rigorous in terms of investigation and research, but there's a veritable lack, a vacuum almost, of conceptual rigor in terms of these kinds of independent investigations, we the people investigations of these kinds of crimes against we the people. And so that's why I think we need to really parse this out and not sort of see these as sort of good, positive, just controversial scraps of controversy in a way. And it's something that I understood fairly early on in terms of September 11th truth and justice activism, was that it was not enough to get the quote unquote truth out there. It had to be done in a core political way, and it had to be done in a way that facilitated people's overall understanding of politics, and the political power, which would include a focus on the who and the why as the reason for focusing on the what and the how. And then the focus on the who and the why is not for its own sense of sort of truth and justice, deep state pornography, but was for core political reasons, which for some reason, sort of people in the peace movement somehow continue to miss that was always the point of 9/11 truth, was justice. And in justice, there was then the precursor for peace. For actually the ending the 9/11 wars took justice for 9/11. Justice for 9/11 took truth for 9/11, as I pointed out before. So I do think these are sort of provocations of some sort in a way.
I agree, and even if it's not intentional, I think that you're right about that. Intentional or not, these are provocation's a perfect word for it. So I guess we're ready to move ahead to the 9/11 paymaster, Kenneth Feinberg.
All right, so we saw the story, another Slate story. This Slate is a really, I think it's very, it's the tip of the tip of the spear in terms of sort of sleazy pseudo liberal.
Um, One interesting thing about Slate is Slate did actually a multi-part audio series on David Duke a couple years back that I listened to in its entirety, and it was very I found to be a very interesting listen. There's a lot in there, but of course, completely missing any question of like Duke being perhaps like this long-term agent operative working to as a as an agent of destabilization to rather than like he's just like just some garden variety racist who made it into almost made it into the highest positions of state and federal government. So it was, but it was so that's a classic example of like how a media outlet like a Slate will operate in terms of like the legacy of like this boogeyman bigot getting into positions in society, but not no type of like conversation about is there more to this than meets the eye? So
Definitely. And it's interesting. Some of the more, I think, touchy episodes that we've done in the past, and the kind of episodes that seem to have been focused on by the whatever sort of people or forces at YouTube who ultimately took down our whole channel, were these kinds of issues. For example, our show about the CNI and CNN and Time Warner about, I believe it's called Weaponized Politics and the Weapons of Policy, or something like that. And it included a lot of the arc here. That one was immediately, very soon after we published it, that one was taken down, I think. Um, or maybe it was a little bit later on, but it was taken down twice. And there's nothing in there that could be thought of as targeting or hate speech or any of these kinds of things. It's core political speech through and through. There are documented facts. There are facts about the who's on the board at the CNI. There's facts about what Steve Bannon was saying to Nigel Farage. All of that. And sure, is there hypotheses and analysis? Yes. So that one is very touchy. And then the show that we did about lifetime actors and lifetime directors or something like that, that dealt exactly with what you're talking about David Duke, and then Spike Lee as portraying the KKK in the David Duke episode, is totally in the realm of where we get into really touchy subjects for a whole element, it looks like. And so these kinds of questions about actually analyzing David Duke, not as this sort of a man of sort of the Ku Klux, just a sort of like organic man of hate in the Ku Klux Klan. But what are the origins of the Ku Klux Klan itself? And then, as we called him, David Duke the Spook. All right, and we think that that is very likely the proper analysis. And then these kinds of depictions of him, whether it's the Slate Limited Hangout or the Spike Lee sort of cinematic potentially provocation around it. Also, limited hangout, very likely. Now, I haven't seen it, so and I haven't listened to that Slate thing, but that's my sense of where these things end up. And so, I think that this is why we continue to attempt to unpack these realms of counterintelligence. They're so crucial, and it's similar in a certain way. The way that you point out, Greg, that the and we were discussing this before when we were talking about 9/11, about how the 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 who and the why can then actually go back and inform the what and the how. And so it makes a lot of sense to not just do it in a linear way, but more in a cyclical and networked analysis kind of way, even when you're dealing with the who, what, when, where, why, and how of journalism or the means, motive, and opportunity. You keep on, if you learn something maybe that looks like it's ahead of you in terms of the basic forensics, if you learn something about who might have motive for something, or how someone might have done something that you can't prove that they did or that was done, you can then use that to cast back onto your basic forensics. This is done in physical scientific hypothesis all the time, and it's you use conceptual frameworks to begin to actually notice phenomena that you might have missed before, and that your conceptual frameworks actually can then help you recognize facts and parse them out from things that you might have missed before, or the detritus of historical phenomenon that pile up, and you begin to miss certain things. And this is why the counterintelligence operations are so powerful, because if they get you asking the wrong question, it doesn't matter where the answer comes from, right? Or if they get you making the wrong claims or the controlled claims, then it doesn't really matter ultimately how well that's perceived or accepted. And so, in a similar kind of way, that understanding the counterintelligence side of the control of the discourse, whether it's this question of who is David Duke actually, what is the nature of this Spike Lee Slate New York Times controversy, apparently, sponsored and backed by the commanding heights of Time Warner HBO, you can begin to then use these counterintelligence analyses to then actually begin to retrace your actual history. For example, Ku Klux Klan itself. In a certain way, it was some of our investigation into the nature of David Duke, who we suspected to be a spook, that then could let us into beginning to unpack this much deeper history of the Ku Klux Klan, the question of how it emerged, the nature of the origins of the B'nai B'rith, the relationship of all of that to the nature of the Civil War, of Confederate intelligence in high places, the nature of the Lincoln assassination, then the birth of the birth child of the B'nai B'rith, the so-called Anti-Defamation League, and then the nature of that as a controlling aspect in relationship to some of these earlier dynamics of African Americans and the Black Jewish relationship and all of that. So these kinds of things are examples of the way that you can use your current counterintelligence analysis to then unpack parts of actual history, certain historical forensics that you might have missed before because you didn't even look for them.
Yeah, I guess my last thing on this will be, because I don't want to get off on too much of a discussion about this, but go back and look at like that time period there in the 1910s, which goes from, of course, the entrance into the First World War, but also you have the establishment of the Anti-Defamation League, coinciding within a couple of years of the of the reformed Ku Klux Klan for the first time since the Reconstruction era, and the film "Birth of a Nation" being mass distributed, which is a celebration of the Klan of the white man in the South rising up to fight back post Civil War from all the oppression they were facing. I mean, it's an extremely fascinating historical timeline. And then in there, of course, you throw in all the intrigue with Woodrow Wilson and Louis Brandeis and the Balfour Declaration. Very, very fascinating time in history.
So much. There was a time on the Antidote where everything kept coming back to like the teens in terms of what we were investigating, based on that whole array of really concentrated history that you're talking about in terms of that time. So we will return to that, I'm sure. And so moving on here now to this Slate story, and Slate with the tagline, "A hot Cheeto in spinach dip." All right, interesting taste maybe for the moment, pretty bad nutrition, I would say. All right, the title is called "What's Fact and What's Fiction in Worth," and that's the name of the film. The Netflix movie stars Michael Keaton as the man in charge of the 9/11 Victim Compensation Fund. Is It Accurate by Matthew Dessem, and this was written September 3rd, 2021, or published September 3rd, 2021, and then shows the picture of Kenneth Feinberg with his hand on his finger on his lips on the left, and then Michael Keaton as Kenneth Feinberg on the right with his finger not quite a similar kind of stance, but his finger not on his lips, actually, but to the side. And so I'm just going to read a little bit of this, and then we'll quickly move into who is Kenneth Feinberg, and then why this is a crucial piece of understanding September 11th, and what I would then say would be part of the counterintelligence part, the cover-up part of September 11th, and maybe the key, maybe the militarized side of the counterintelligence operation, meaning the most threatening part of the aftermath of an event like this would be potentially the legal. And thinking back of what was portrayed to me, told to me by someone who had also put in those 9/11 treason papers, like I had, and gotten back from contacts that the intelligence community does not fear the politicians, but it does fear the justice, the judiciary. And so similarly, around something like September 11th, that would be the key locus to control that would need a military precision of control after the fact in terms of the counterintelligence cover-up part of it would be the legal process. And so in order to do that, there needed to be an elimination of as much as possible of those who had standing, legal standing, meaning the family members of the victims of the originating attack. But also you can think about this as almost a core political or even spiritual, who had spiritual standing, and the nature of the family members, and even think back to the controversies over the family members and how that carried weight. And it wasn't just because it was legal, it was because there was an understanding that there was spiritual standing there. So there's something really crucial to understanding the the uh, the paying off of the family members of the September 11th victims who would have had standing if they had been able to push the legal pathway all the way through. All right, quote, Worth, the new movie from the director Sarah Colangelo and screenwriter Max Borenstein, or Stein, I don't know, tells the story of Kenneth Feinberg, the man who was put in charge of the September 11th Victim Compensation Fund. The fund, set up only days after the attacks, was Congress's attempt to simultaneously protect airlines from ruinous lawsuits and compensate the families of the victims for their unfathomable losses. We've consulted Feinberg's book, profiles of some of its main characters, and other sources to sort out what's true and what's artistic license in the Netflix drama. Kenneth Feinberg. Kenneth Feinberg, the lawyer who is special master of the September 11th Victim Compensation Fund, is played by Michael Keaton in the movie, and his portrait is typical for this kind of movie. There are a lot of correct details, but the overall shape of events has been massaged a little to fit into a film narrative. Feinberg chronicled his experiences overseeing the fund in What is Life Worth? The Unprecedented Effort to Compensate the Victims of 9/11. And it's one of the primary sources for Borenstein's screenplay. As seen in the movie, Feinberg is immediately identifiable as being from Massachusetts, but his accent is a little less strong than Keaton's extremely fun performance. By way of comparison, C-SPAN has video of the December 20th, 2001 press conference at which he explained the Victim Compensation Fund. And then there is a link to that. Feinberg's love of class. I mean, one thing though, note the timing of this too, of how quick it was. And yes, are there those credible explanations and very likely reasons behind the quick establishment of it in terms of attempting to shield the airlines from potential civil suit collapse? Yeah, definitely. And to give the family members something? Yes. But even that, mainly so that they wouldn't ask as many questions and then so they wouldn't have standing. That's what I would say in terms of why this was pushed quickly. Think about this versus the 9/11 Commission, which was put off for as long as possible until they then did it and then named Henry Kissinger to be the original head. I wonder what kind of outline, what kind of script he would have written, and whether it would have been different from Zelikow if Kissinger had remained the head of the 9/11 Commission.
I imagine there wouldn't have been too much of a difference. Maybe you got a more strictly, I don't know, more strictly Israeli-centric, Zionist-centric agenda with Zelikow. But Kissinger, we could say overlaps that, but I think it's bigger, broader with Kissinger than just that. But I doubt in terms of like the strengthening of the official story. I'm sure there wouldn't have been too much overlap. I'm sure, and I imagine you might have still had some of the same players in terms of the Keane and Hamilton and those types. So I mean, it's an interesting question. I imagine it wouldn't have differed too much.
I think you're probably right, but I think you're also definitely right about that. The Zelikow was like the sort of core Zionist scripting represented in terms of that, and Kissinger would have been a much more macro, global, more multipolar potentially, as you might call it, scripting. All right, I'm going to read a couple more paragraphs from the Slate article, and then we'll delve a little bit more into Feinberg, what's like missing on his background, even like in terms of like a Wikipedia sourcing from this article. All right, quote, Feinberg's love of classical music is real, as is the listening room in his house, complete with an extensive and well-cataloged CD collection. The bravura sequence in which Feinberg, ensconced in his headphones, fails to notice his fellow passengers receiving news of the September 11 attacks, however, is an invention of the movie. On the morning of September 11, the real Feinberg learned about the attack in stages. He saw the aftermath of the first plane hitting the World Trade Center on a TV in a common area at the University of Pennsylvania after teaching a class there. And then on a train from Philadelphia to Wilmington, passengers with portable radios spread the news of the second tower and the attack on the Pentagon. He wasn't anywhere near the Pentagon and did not see the aftermath from a train window. The movie also fudges some details about Feinberg's involvement in the September 11 Victims Compensation Fund, implying that Senator Ted Kennedy asked Feinberg to help out because so few people specialize in victim compensation. Feinberg did have an extensive experience in that sort of case, having worked on the Agent Orange settlements as well as other high-profile mediations, but he lobbied to get the position. The movie shows him in a meeting with Senators Ted Kennedy and Chuck Hagel on September 22nd, 2001, discussing how the Victims Fund should work. Although it's an effective way to deliver a lot of exposition, that meeting probably didn't happen. September 22nd was the day George W. Bush signed the bill establishing the fund, and by then the details had already been hammered down. That's less than 2 weeks after the September 11th, 2001. Okay, back to the text. Quote, according to Feinberg, he got the job by calling Hagel, who'd been in the United States Department of Veterans Affairs during Feinberg's work on the Agent Orange cases. After reading about the bill in the newspaper, Hagel advanced Feinberg's name to Attorney General John Ashcroft, who appointed Feinberg after meeting with him twice. Okay, we'll leave it there in terms of this article. What's Fact and What's Fiction in Worth by Matthew Dessem in Slate, September 3rd, 2021. And it's interesting what they say about his background in mediation and what they don't say about it. And it is very interesting that it portrays him as having been, solicited for this role rather than even the limited hangout aspect of him pursuing it. He just heard about it, So I'm suspicious that either of those are true, but it seems to be more true that this was not, let's see, this is Ted Kennedy and Chuck Hagel. But who could do this? We needed to be able to get the best person for the job. Who could do this? Oh, Ken Feinberg, he could do it. Now, what's interesting is that there is this background between Ted Kennedy and Kenneth Feinberg. Now, moving on to the Wikipedia page for Kenneth Feinberg. Quote, Kenneth Roy Feinberg, born October 23, 1945, is an American attorney specializing in mediation and alternative dispute resolution. Feinberg was appointed Special Master of the U.S. Government's September 11th Victim Compensation Fund and served as the Special Master for TARP Executive Compensation. Oh, in 2008, he was also involved in that, which when I questioned then Secretary of the Treasury, Hank Paulson, I asked whether he'd gotten warning of that economic control demolition like his firm, Goldman Sachs, had before September 11th. So interesting, I'd forgotten that Feinberg had also been involved in the TARP bailouts for 2008, which more and more people recognize there was a controlled demolition. It was not just about greed out of control per se. Now that's a much more complicated thing that we'll put aside for now. But just the fact that he was involved in that controversy, that was one of the most controversial handouts in American history, really, economically. All right, back to this Wikipedia page with Kenneth Feinberg. Quote, additionally, Feinberg served as the government-appointed administrator of the BP Deepwater Horizon Disaster Victim Compensation Fund. Feinberg was appointed by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to administer the One Fund, the victim assistance fund established in the wake of the 2013 Boston Marathon bombings. Feinberg was also retained by General Motors to assist in their recall response and by Volkswagen to oversee their U.S. compensation of VW diesel owners affected by the Volkswagen emissions scandal. Feinberg was hired by the Boeing Company in July 2019 to oversee distribution of $50 million to support 737 MAX crash victim families. Okay, and aside there, I mean, we haven't investigated this much, right? But there are serious questions about those, what's going on there in terms of cyber and all of that. So just the list of all this. Quote, Feinberg is also an adjunct professor at the Columbia University School of Law, University of Pennsylvania Law School, Georgetown University Law Center, New York University School of Law, the University of Virginia School of Law, and at the Benjamin N. Cardoso School of Law. Okay, the list here, I'm going to just keep going through this. I'll just
I
read.
believe
Oh, go for it.
Zelikow is also at the University of Virginia, so that means
Yes.
just throw that in there.
Yeah, that's true. All right. I'll just go quick. I'll just read the list of all of these ones that he was involved in, and then we'll go a little bit more deeply into the background here. Life and career, the section. Okay, there's 14 points here. 1.1 is the September 11th Victim Compensation Fund, which has two parts, the 8-part Feinberg Plan, and 2, the history of participation. Then 2, the Hokie Spirit Memorial Fund. Then the Special Master for Executive Compensation. That's the TARP one. Then the BP Oil Spill Fund.
The Hokie Spirit Memorial Fund is the 2007 Virginia Tech School campus massacre.
Oh, so oh my gosh, dude. All right. Then next, the Penn State settlement. Is that talking about the pedophilia? I imagine, right?
That would be Jerry Sandusky, yes, and that whole scandal, which I sense, and like I don't want to speculate, but I sense that I think there's already is evidence out there, and there's information out there that points it as being much bigger than just simply a perverted defensive coordinator at Penn State University and the coach who let it happen. And so, yeah, I mean, and of course, the involvement also, I believe, Louis Freeh was involved in that investigation, the FBI and all that stuff. I mean, it's deeper than just that. So, I mean, his name keeps popping up in all these things.
Yes, and there's now we begin to understand that from Penn State. I think you're right. It's just deeper. It's deeper than just this isolated area. And when you begin to see the totality of the way that these kinds of pedophilia operations are covered up, but also used. For example, Epstein Maxwell, that whole network. Or then going back to something like Boys Town and the Omaha scandal, or then all the questions of call boys surrounding the White House, Jerry Spence, all of that, Gannon. You begin to see that this is a network of at least of operations. And then now into what's going on in relationship to the understanding of the FBI cover up of the Larry Nassar pedophilia scandal.
Yeah, there's a lot of names. You can't help but think that there's interconnecting here between, you got Sandusky, you got Larry Nassar, you've got the neighboring state of Ohio and the Ohio State Wrestling and Congressman. I mean, Jim Jordan, you'd have to, like, you'd have to be naive not to at least question if there's like some type of conjunction or continuity at some level or another with all these things.
Yes. All right. So let's go through this some more, and maybe what we'll do, Greg, is just finish up with these sort of discussing these two depictions, these two media creations of the Spike Lee, and then this one about Worth and Kenneth Feinberg, and then finish this as a sort of a part 2A, and then we'll record again in relationship to 2B around some of the discourse aspect of September 11th and the 20th anniversary, and touch on things that Caitlin Johnstone said and wrote, or what was Media Roots podcast, what were they doing, or what was the certain aspects of the peace and justice movement doing in terms of this mass peace action code pink Zoom that I was on, and these kinds of things. So let's is that cool with you, Greg? We'll just continue on with a little bit more Feinberg.
Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, that sounds good.
About 10 more minutes, and then we'll finish up. All right. Oh, so we didn't even finish the whole list here. All right. But it's the who's who. It's it's basically most big, deep event a sort of a networked criminal event that was of at least what I remember my adulthood. Is that's what I'm seeing here basically. And maybe not every single one, but most of the serious ones, like that Virginia Tech shooting, that was a big deal at the time. I remember, especially it was like in the middle of the Iraq War and things surrounding that. Um, all right, so then after that, all right, we got the Penn State settlement. Oh, the Aurora Victim Relief Fund. Oh, so that was that. Oh my gosh, dude. The Newtown Sandy Hook Community Foundation. Oh my, wow. General Motors car recall. Special master to oversee Treasury implementations of Multi-Employer Pension Reform Act regulations. I'm not familiar with what that's about. But let's keep going through here. Volkswagen emissions scandal, the Terrorism Compensation Fund. Is that the? Oh, that's a whole nother thing in 2016. Victims of State-Sponsored Terrorism Fund. Did that go along with JASTA? That seems related to JASTA potentially, actually. Then the in regards to foreign exchange and benchmark rates antitrust litigation. Then the Archdiocese of New York Independent Reconciliation and Compensation Program.
And I think that would be, I'm not too well versed on like the Catholic Church scandals, but that's another very highly connected institution in terms of credible and proven and credible, proven documented activity and credible accusations of like just all kinds of activity within the Catholic Church. That's another elite institution right there that Feinberg's involved in this whole process for. So.
Yes, and the foreign exchange and benchmark rates antitrust litigation. I'm not sure what that relates to, whether that's surrounding the LIBOR scandal or what that's related to. But I mean, the concentration of these is just wild, actually. Okay, and then the United Methodist Church. That was the final one. All right, back to the beginning of his life and career. Quote, Feinberg was born in Brockton, Massachusetts. He received a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst in 1967 and a JD degree from the New York University School of Law in 1970. He worked for 5 years as an administrative assistant and chief of staff for U.S. Senator Ted Kennedy. Dang. And as a prosecutor for the U.S. Attorney General. Before founding his own firm, the Feinberg Group, now the law offices of Kenneth Feinberg, in 1993, he was a founding partner at the Washington office of K. Scholler, LLP. I'm sure we could find a whole interesting thing there if we were to dig into it. Feinberg had served as a court-appointed special settlement master in cases including Agent Orange product liability litigation, asbestos personal injury litigation, and DES cases. Oh, that's a non-steroidal estrogen medication which is presently rarely used. In the past, it was widely used for a variety of indications, including pregnancy support for women with a history of recurrent miscarriage. DES, diethylstilbestrol. Feinberg was also one of the 3 arbitrators who determined the fair market value of the Zapruder film of the Kennedy assassination, and was one of 2 arbitrators who determined the allocation of legal fees in the Holocaust slave labor litigation. He's a former lecturer in law at a number of U.S. law schools. And Feinberg was the chairman of the board of directors for the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation. Wow. I mean, just the combination of that he's the chairman of the board of directors for the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation and was also involved in the Zapruder film, fair market value, and then worked for Ted Kennedy. for 5 years. It's just I don't know exactly what to think of it, but it's stunning.
If he was old enough, he would have been involved in like mob or payouts to mob victims under Attorney General Robert Kennedy's investigation.
All right. All right, let's do just a little bit more before we wrap this up. All right, it goes through appointed by Attorney General John Ashcroft to be special master of the fund. This is the September 11th Victim Compensation Fund. Feinberg worked for 33 months entirely pro bono. Gee. He developed the regulations governing the administration of the fund and administered all aspects of the program, including evaluating applications, determining appropriate compensation, and disseminating awards. Now, by the way, remember that he was then subsequently member after he worked for quote unquote 33 months entirely pro bono. He then passed it off, I believe, at that point to Sheila Birnbaum, who came from Skadden Arps, which is a crucial firm for all around, and even they had a little piece in the 11-9 prosecutions. But also go look at Kenneth Bialkin, I believe, at Skadden Arps, and the key role of Skadden Arps as a high technology corporate legal firm, especially in relationship to Israeli cyber. And then to have the second 9/11 paymaster, Sheila Birnbaum, come out of there, I think is sort of telling too. All right. It goes through. Oh, look, the 8-part Feinberg plan. In his book titled What is Life Worth, Feinberg described the 8-part plan which is applied to approaching the September 11th Victim Compensation Fund. 1. Identifying someone with sufficient and exceptionally broad experience in mass tort action mediation, litigation, and settlement, which Feinberg possessed through his previous personal experience as a political activist and his work in the Agent Orange compensation settlement. There's a whole thing, too, there that needed to be dealt with and covered up. 2, to support and follow the law regarding the proportional compensation of victims based on estimated losses from future earnings by hiring a full staff of accountants and attorneys to track and service each claim individually. 3, accumulate... Oh, go for it, Greg.
Oh, I was just saying, even without like not understanding like the depths of all of this, there's just something inherently cold and almost cruel about determining the value of like how much people are worth to be given monetarily for their dead relatives. I mean, it's just there's something to me that seems inherently very cold about that and off about that.
Well, it's definitely the case that's the focus, the public focus in wrestling with the controversy over this story. And it's definitely something very cold about it. There's something even colder about using money to make sure that they can't get the actual justice part of the legal system, which has to do with, first and foremost, truth of solving the crime about who actually killed their family members, let alone what their family members' life and death was worth. That it was ultimately, we can see, and now I'm not directly accusing any single individual here, but it was used to make sure that the people who had standing would not have standing anymore. And this was all operated out of Judge Hellerstein's courtroom. Judge Alvin Hellerstein had a son who was apparently legally involved with a 9/11 suspect security failure company, an Israeli company called ICTS, which was on the quote unquote the plane side of the operation. So yeah, this is dirty politics here at the very least.
Yeah, it goes from ethical, moral questions of like the coldness and of valuing like the financial compensation of like lives of victims of family members of victims to all out and out just even worse in the aspects of like serving as an aspect of the ongoing cover up to basically silence people with money or legally keep people from talking due to money. So I mean, yeah, there's a lot of consequence there. It goes all the way from the moral and ethical to just outright just deception and actively taking part in a cover up. So
And before we, in these last minutes here of our recording today, before finishing up the remaining parts of the 8-part Feinberg plan, and especially as the key delivery is the eighth plank of it, I would say. Let me just read from the history of participation section here in relationship to what you are noticing about this. Is that um, quote, early in the process, he was described as aloof and arrogant. Feinberg was subjected to some very public criticism at meetings, in the media, and on websites. Quote, I underestimated the emotion of this at the beginning, unquote, Feinberg has said. Quote, I didn't fully appreciate how soon this program had been established after 9/11, so there was a certain degree of unanticipated anger directed at me that I should have been more attuned to, unquote. It was up to Feinberg to make the decisions on how much each family of a 9/11 victim would receive. Quote, it's a brutal, sort of cold thing to do. Anybody who looks at this program and expects that by cutting a U.S. Treasury check, you are going to make 9/11 families happy is vastly misunderstanding what's going on with this program, unquote, said Feinberg. Quote, there's not one family member I've met who wouldn't gladly give back the check, or in many cases their own lives, to have that loved one back. Happy never enters into this equation, unquote. Feinberg was able to change the mind of some of his harshest critics. Charles Wolfe, whose wife died in the North Tower, renamed his highly critical website called, quote, Fix the Fund to, quote, The Fund is Fixed, unquote. At first, he called Feinberg, quote, patronizing, manipulative, and at times even cruel, unquote. He later remarked, quote, to have one of your sharpest critics follow through on a promise and not only join the program he was criticizing, but promote it to his peers says a lot about you and the way you have adjusted both the program and your attitude. Today, I have complete faith in you, unquote. And finishing up here, in 2005, his book titled What is Life Worth? The Unprecedented Effort to Compensate the Victims of 9/11 was published. Feinberg wrote that a widow of one firefighter cursed him, saying, quote, I spit on you and your children, unquote, for being unfair in his compensation awards. And then back in finishing up here to the 8-part Feinberg plan. Number 2, quote, to support and follow the law regarding the proportional compensation of victims based on estimated losses from future earnings by hiring a full staff of accountants and attorneys to track and service each claim individually. 3, accumulate all the reports and applications along with counterclaims to gauge and initiate the direct compensation process. 4, the value of informed discretion in compensating claimants under the formula of keeping compensation under the rule of thumb that 85% of the money should not go to 15% of the richest claimant families by narrowing the gap between the largest and the smallest compensations paid to claimants. 5, with a mind to the future, the process of the program should be maintained and serviced as a precedent for future courts to use in future compensation cases as needed. The actions taken should be uniform in their approach. 6, there would be, quote, no substitute for hard work and legal craftsmanship, unquote, of rigorous intellectual honesty. 7, the support of Senator Edward Kennedy would be recognized throughout the process. And then finally, 8, lawsuits were to be discouraged as contrary to the spirit of the law establishing the compensation fund, unquote. And that is really the payoff. The payoff. They, of course, Feinberg is not quoted as saying, "I don't think any of the family members would trade the money for their loved ones' lives." The question is whether they would have traded the money for the truth and justice in relationship to the murderers. The still, I would say, outstanding many of them, free still murderers of their family members. That was the real serious question, was whether they would trade the truth and justice for the payoff money.
yeah, I couldn't agree more. That's that right there shows you, and like it's and you can see the pattern with like it seems in all of these cases. I wonder, like, it's the same type of legality framework in all of these cases. Basically, is Feinberg acting to basically legally and financially tie people's hands in terms of taking legal and otherwise action to ensure maybe justice in some of the questionable entities that he's represented over the years in terms of these lawsuits, in addition to being helping, I think, to establish official narratives from things like September 11th to school shootings and on like that. And I just see the pattern there, and I think that that is a good question to be asking. Like, is he acting in this capacity in all of these cases, whether it's September 11th or whether it's Aurora or whether it's Volkswagen emissions scandals or Catholic Church archdiocese? It seems that there's a pattern developing here, and it seems to be protecting um, big time companies and players in terms of actual and just buying out people's almost legal and uh, ethical moral silence. It seems like.
And it seems like that, and these are really crucial cases. A lot of them, or if not all of them, the ones that he's been involved in, and including in terms of this is a very sensitive area where the victims in many cases of these are being compensated, and the door is being closed at the same time, as a structure is created under which to allege, in our allegedly self-governing democratic society, that we are uh, holding ourselves responsible, holding the guilty responsible, have gotten to the bottom of the truth, are airing out our dirty laundry. And to me, it looks like in every one of these, especially these deeper cases, it's obvious the case that this was effectively done to shut the book on the case in terms of potential legal and political standings in many ways. And so the proper response to all of this is for those of us who still see that the truth has not been claimed, because obviously justice has not been actually done, that we have to re-engage with, especially something like September 11th. And this is why this is seen as the sort of the capstone of his career in many ways, uh, even after all these other big things. And then this strain of the Kennedy and all of this is unsettling to me too. Uh, and that was the seventh step of it, is to recognize that Edward Kennedy was crucial to this process, and then his involvement at the John F. Kennedy Library, I think, center, the head of the board, whatever it was that he was, and
Involvement with the distribution of and the value of the Zapruder film, and that, of course, being the key from the key shaper and purveyor of the narrative and the theory surrounding Kennedy. So,
and remember, just the on the surface question of the Zapruder film, quote unquote, is Abraham Zapruder. What was he not a high level Scottish Rite Jewish Freemason? I know that's a touchy question to ask, but I believe it's true. I believe the answer is yes, and so this whole array here of Feinberg's involvement throughout the decades is stunning, and neither, I believe, this film made nor this Slate article is going to get to the root of it. So, but we're going to work to continue to assess some of the roots of all this ongoing cover up of criminality. So, all right, until next time, Greg, thank you very much.
thank you.
Okay, Antidote, we are out. Bye, y'all.